a combination of a French name and an African name, and so in the case of one of the families that I was able to assist coming to the USA and to Texas, is Marcian Rusuruyi, and so Rusuruyi means, you know, lover of God or something, and I said, Marcian, I said, I know that each of your children has a different name, but it's going to be so confusing for them as American citizens if they'll have to explain whether their parents are divorced or not, and so forth. I said, I suggest that they all become Rusuruyi while they're here, so they all change their names legally, so they still have their first name that is French, but they all have the name of their father.
You've been a professor, a dean, a businessman, chairman of the State Energy Board, congressman, United States Senator, U.S. Ambassador on 3 occasions, special representative of the U.S. Secretary of State from a small town in Texas. Who would have guessed, huh?
It sounds like I can't hold a job, doesn't it?
It's just you've had such a broad brush of opportunities and exposures, and yet you're here today and over the next couple of days at an international law conference. Would you have ever guessed that your career path would have found you in such a situation where you'll be talking about from bloodshed to hope in Burundi?
No, I certainly did not know that. I was very fortunate, I feel, in my parentage and in the opportunities I was given. I had a deeply spiritual mother and a father who was very successful came from a very small town and went to university 1 year, but was very successful in business and employed 250 people. And so I had financial security and I had inner security. And my mother used to say, Robert, you have been given many opportunities. Just remember that everything that you take from life, you have to give back to life. And I decided very early on that first I was intending to be a stockbroker when I went to college, and then I thought, you know, to me, if I'm successful as a stockbroker, at the end of my life, I will have moved some pieces of paper, and if I'm as smart as the average person but study harder, I can probably make money. But I don't know that I will have done anything to benefit society, and so I changed my direction. I thought I would teach in university, and then when I was overseas getting my doctorate at Oxford, I came really to appreciate the United States of America. I thought, you know, my father employs 250 people. He's very important in the life of this small town I come from. And if he had grown up in England, where at the time that I was there, 4% of the population attended university, and that was all, and it was near 30% attending college or universities in the USA. And I thought, Dad wouldn't have made it, and his business talents would have been lost. And whatever its failings, I believe the United States of America offers more opportunities to more people to develop the best that is in them than any nation in the history of the world. And I decided someday I want to be part of that government. And how I was going to go from working on a 16th century poet to the U.S. Congress, I didn't know. And it wasn't an obvious connection, Greg. But it was real.
Yeah.
But inwardly, you know, there's this line somewhere, and I never know, I can never cite scripture and verse, but I can remember the scriptures, and there's something about, and Mary held this secret deep inside her heart, and so forth, and I held this secret deep in my heart, but that someday I wanted to do that, and so ultimately I was privileged to have that opportunity.
How'd you get into the political fray?
What happened was that at a relatively early age, I was 36, and I'd just been made Vice Provost and Dean of the Undergraduate College of Arts and Sciences at Duke. And frankly, there was a president, a chancellor, a provost, and 3 of us who were vice provosts. And so I was far and away the youngest bull in the pen, and the others were all 20 years or more older than I, and I was feeling my oats, you know. And my father became ill with a very fast cancer. And his 3 businesses, he owned a hosiery mill and a hotel and a car dealership. And they all were his. And my mother had never dealt in business. My sister hadn't. There were only 2 children. And I thought about it and I considered it carefully, and Dad died very quickly, and I, on the last weekend, I would fly home from Duke on the weekends to try to help deal with the will and all the sorts of other things. And I said, we were on the back porch of the house overlooking the river, and I said, Dad, I'm thinking of resigning as dean at Duke and coming back home and putting the businesses in order and running for Congress. What do you think of that? And Dad, whose main business was his car dealership, he said, you know, son, I always thought politics is a pretty dirty business. I said, yeah, Dad, you've been a car dealer 45 years. I said, a lot of people think it's a dirty business. I said, it's not the business that's dirty. Right. It's what you bring to it. Right. He said, well, you're right. He said, son, you can do anything. There's nothing you can't do, but just do it for the right reason, because you care about the country. Right. And that was part of my last conversation with him. And even after that, I wasn't sure. And finally, I remember about 4 or 5 weeks later, I decided, this is it. I've got to do it. And I walked in and talked with Terry Sanford, who was former governor of North Carolina, actually made the seconding speech to nominate John Kennedy, and was president of Duke. A wonderful man, and particularly good in understanding people. He had a keen understanding of people. And I walked in and told him that I was going to resign, and I first said I was going to go home for the business things. And he said, now, Bob, let me talk to you as a lawyer. He said, Bob, we'll give you a year's leave of absence. You go on back home there to Texas. You're just getting started in this job. We want you here at Duke. And you're just getting going, and you're doing a fine job for us. We'll give you a year's leave of absence. You don't have to worry about it. So then I went on to say, well, the other thing is, Terry, I'm planning to run for Congress. Well, then he really said, don't give up your tenured position. But I said, you know, Terry, I said, I'm single. I have given Duke single-mindedly everything I had for 12 years, and you will have it until July 1. But I said, I'm only good at anything, the only way I can do a decent job is if I'm totally committed. I said, I've been totally committed to Duke, but now I want to do this next thing. And if I am going to walk a tightrope, I cannot think of a safety net. I cannot think of failure. I said, if I'm going to go home and run for Congress, if I'm going to give up the thing I most wanted in life to do the next thing, I cannot think of failure. So I will not come, and I said, I'm going to run, and I believe I'll win, but if I don't win, I'll run until I win. But I said, if I came back to Duke, you would be second choice. And you deserve somebody who will make it first choice. Yeah. And so I resigned, and I went home, and I will tell you, Greg, that the first poll that we did in San Antonio, which made a part of a district that the district itself, my congressional district, because it's so unpopulated, was bigger than the state of Pennsylvania. It was 50,000 square miles, 450 miles long congressional district. And but part of its population was part of San Antonio. In that first poll, I was behind 64-4, and we won. And so that, as Robert Frost says, and that made all the difference. Yeah.
And you were in Congress for 2 terms?
I was there for 2 terms. My second term, I ran against an 18-year incumbent in the Senate, John Tower. And in the end, John Tower got 49.7, and I got 49.4. But the Republicans at that time, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, had set up a party called La Raza Unida, which was to pull Hispanic votes away from Democrats, which I was, into another party. They knew they couldn't get it in the Republican Party, but they'd pull it into no man's land. And so he had 1.1% in between. So I missed by literally 3 votes per 1,000, by 4,000 out of 2 million votes.
Was Tower in the middle of his scandal then at that time?
No, well, no, the scandal came, we knew all that stuff, but I had never run on that basis. I mean, we knew the man had a huge problem with alcohol and a huge zipper problem, but I didn't didn't talk about that. I didn't believe that was the way to win.
Right.
So that came out when he was nominated to be Secretary of Defense. He was turned down by his Senate colleagues because of his alcoholism.
Just a couple of local connections. When you were the provost at Duke, that was when you would have connected with Dale Robbins?
I did, and I was very fortunate to do so. I was single. I never expected to marry at all, really. And I had a lot of time, and at Oxford, where I'd studied, there was this wonderful interaction between faculty and student. For an undergraduate at Oxford, even today, and certainly then, every week had 1 hour alone with his professor in his major subject to write an essay and to have a discussion one-on-one. And so there was this remarkable interaction, and unlike American universities, the people in the very loftiest positions were all available to you. It didn't matter how well known they were. You could just go, you would write them a note, and they'd come. You could come and see them. And so I had that experience, and I wanted to help bring that to Duke. When I was dean, we changed the curriculum, and I was involved in that to bring in more contacts. But I enjoyed people. Candidly, I was less a scholar, although I published articles in a book, but I was less a scholar than I was interested in the whole person, not just a professional thing. And so I came to know Dale then, and we became very good friends. He was very active in student government, was active on the committee to implement the new curriculum, which basically I had been the architect of. And so we came to know one another then, and Dale was one of these wonderful people who never broke that connection, and I didn't either. And he came down when I was named ambassador to Burundi. He and his family flew down to Washington, but I used to have lunch or dinner with Dale a lot. Yeah. And I think, I'm trying to remember, I forgot to ask him, but I think he and some of his friends used to call me Cowboy Bob. So it was a pretty informal relationship.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly not as if he came from an urban area, as you'll soon see, as you see here. It's
a beautiful area. It's exquisite. I can't say exactly it's like a Grandma Moses painting, because her paintings were not that detailed. They were more primitive, but it's a gorgeous area. I love the maple trees. I love the capacity of this area to hold on to the best in its tradition. And we in Texas, I was going down the road and I said, Dale, I said, you don't have any billboards. I said, my wife's on the city council and she's having to battle billboards all the time, and without much success. You have done extremely well in cherishing your own traditions. And I feel that public service is it's a responsibility, and it's a sort of sacred obligation to preserve that which you have received and to pass it on. It's an act of stewardship. And I think that the people in this area have been very good stewards of their environment and their history. And I admire it greatly, and I would be happy to spend more time here.
Well, we look forward to that opportunity when your wife can join you, as well as your family. And your sidekick Dale has done a terrific job of being a steward. He's very much involved in the community. He was supervisor of the township of Bustye for eons, and has done a terrific job. So you've obviously imparted much. We also have another Duke graduate who will be introducing you tonight, Stan Lundeen. Your paths crossed in Congress, right?
They did indeed. And at the time that I was in Congress, in the 70s, when I was in the House, there was a much better atmosphere than there is today. There was not the divisiveness. And I was very strong on civil rights issues, but I was also a very strong free market person. And it was just at the time of the OPEC oil embargo, and I was fortunate, as I've been so fortunate in a lot of things, to have a 19-year-old kid from Harvard, who was from San Antonio, who dropped out of Harvard a semester to come to work for me, and he made me the energy expert in Congress because at age 19, I mean, the guy is a genius, literally. Today he is mayor of Houston, our nation's 4th largest city, and a multimillionaire, but he his parents were both school teachers from San Antonio, but he instructed me, and so I worked very closely with the Ford White House. The Democrats, which I was, had a 2-to-1 majority, literally 2-to-1 in the House. But for free market kind of questions, you really needed to work with Republicans. And more fiscally conservative Democrats worked, and so I was in the Ford White House as much as I was in the Carter White House.
Right. Then your next step, you actually run for, you talked about running for Senate.
Yes. And I missed, and that's when Carter named me Ambassador at Large Coordinator for Mexican Affairs. The idea was that, if we have pollution problems, it probably doesn't affect Germany. And if we have problems of immigration, well, that doesn't affect France. But with Mexico as an immediate neighbor, there were all of these interactions, and the Department of State, an ambassador, a regular ambassador, couldn't deal with all these things. So the idea was to establish someone in Washington who would be an ambassador at large over assistant secretaries in these various dimensions to try to coordinate policy. Mm-hmm. Now, you can try to do that, but Washington is well known for its turf battles, and getting an assistant secretary of energy or something else to pay attention to an ambassador at large, whatever his title, is not just done at the snap of a finger.
Right.
And so it was a position that I enjoyed holding, and I felt that it did some useful things, but it didn't transform the relationships between Mexico and the USA. But I appreciated that opportunity.
Then you go back into academia?
I went back to Texas because I said I served 2 years under Carter and 10 days under Reagan. This was a political appointment, and they dropped the position entirely, the Reagan administration did. So I went back home, and I did things in business and academia. I held a chair at Rice University and at Texas University to teach one course usually, and so then I was teaching in government basically, and teaching out of my experience rather than my English literature background. And I got married. I was old enough to get married at 47. So got married, and then I thought probably my chance for the Senate had passed, although I wanted to do it. And Lloyd Benson resigned as senator from Texas to take a position as Secretary of Treasury under Bill Clinton. And the governor named me because I'd been so close earlier, and
Ann Richards, right?
Ann Richards named me to be interim senator. So then I thought, well, finally I got here, and now I'll never leave. And there was a special election in which people had to go to the polls just to vote for U.S. senator. And it came at a time when Clinton's popularity in Texas was 22%. It was the absolute low point. There was gays in the military and Hillary's health proposals, neither of which were popular. But I don't blame them for the fact that I lost. The only elections I'd ever lost were 0.1% and 0.3, and I just got swamped in the sort of Republican tide. But only 4% of the voters turned out. So then, on the night of the election returns, I was sitting with my wife, and I said, "Honey, I don't even take it personally." I said, 2 years ago, I just got 58% statewide. And I said, and I haven't done anything shameful, and that was to be elected to the position that directs energy policy. But I said, I've given up most of my financial position for the privilege of public service, and it's been a good trade for me. But I said, I had a chance to travel widely, and I said, we have young children. If we could have an ambassadorship, it would be a privilege to represent the United States overseas. And so I talked with the White House about an ambassadorship, and in the end, wound up in Burundi.
When they called you and said, hey, we'd like to have you consider a few spots, and they mentioned Burundi, what was your family thinking?
Well, the last thing they said after mentioning several possibilities was, would you consider Burundi? And I said, yes, give me 24 or 48 hours to let you know. And I went in, and it was a family gathering. It was my oldest child's 5th birthday, and we were celebrating it and had the candles on the cake. And so my wife and family said, what did they say? What did the White House say? And I said, well, they mentioned a number of places, and said the last they mentioned was Burundi. My brother-in-law said, Burundi, where's Burundi? And I said, well, I think I know, let's go to the globe. And I found it right in the heart of Central Africa. And first my wife said, Burundi, no way, that's an insult, you deserve better. And I said, no, honey, it's not it's a privilege to represent the United States of America anywhere. And I said, and I haven't accepted. But the next morning I told her, I said, Kathleen, I cannot tell you why. I don't have any external rational reasons, but I said, intuitively, I just feel there's some reason we should go to Burundi. And if you don't object, I'd like to phone the White House and say they can forget about these other locations and that we go to Burundi. And she was gracious enough to say yes. And she fell in love with Africa, as did I. And my oldest daughter, now 20, but was 6 when she came to Burundi, came to me at age 12, said, Dad, I've decided I'm going to become a doctor, but I'm going to practice in Africa where there's a need. Mm-hmm. And I took her at age 16 to a hospital in Namibia so remote that most of the people had never seen a white person before. And she was absolutely comfortable in this situation. There were people dying of AIDS and other diseases on the floor because there weren't enough hospital beds. She went into the operating room at age 16, this blonde, blue-eyed little girl, and was totally at ease with these people and absolutely loving and caring and happy. And I thought most adults would probably be uncomfortable in this circumstance. Wow. But so it was life-changing for us, and in a very positive way.
You wrote a book about the subject, From Bloodshed to Hope in Burundi, Our Embassy Years During Genocide. And on the back said the story of Burundi is our story, not simply the story of Africans or Americans, but all of us. What was meant by that, you know? But this is Desmond Tutu saying.
Yes, this was Desmond Tutu, the Nobel Peace Prize winner. I think what Archbishop Tutu meant, what I would hope the book conveys, is in the end, every ethnic distinction, every political distinction, every thing in life that separates one person from another is minuscule and unimportant. Just before they finally pulled me out of Burundi, I was having breakfast in the garden one morning, and 2 of the gardeners came and they said, Mr. Ambassador, can you help us? The army came through and slaughtered 40 people in this village last night. And I pivoted and I said, phoned the embassy and I said, come with the camera and let me go right away. And I went to this spot where there were about 250 people gathered who'd been driven from their homes by the army's slaughter and plunder the night before. And at any rate, there were 4 dead bodies, and I'll just say of the last one that I came to, I'd gone to the father and said, could I look at this body or would it cause you too much pain? It was wrapped up in a brightly colored cloth. He unwrapped it. There was a 5-year-old child whose head had been split open with an axe, and the white brains were showing out. And then they cut off his genitals to add mutilation to murder. Mm-hmm. And I looked at this poor peasant child, because of these 250 people, only one person there had a pair of shoes. Everyone else was barefoot. That's how poor they were. And I looked at this child and I thought, what chance had that child anyway? And I thought, that's terrible. That is a hideous thought. I don't know what that child could have been. Could have been a Martin Luther King. Could have been a Nelson Mandela. Could have been an Albert Einstein. I don't know. What I do know is that in my set of values, I can't worship a God that I don't think loves all equally. Mm-hmm. And if God loves all equally, then in the cosmic calculus, every life is of equal value. And that means that child's life is as valuable as mine, maybe more valuable if it was younger. And if it's equal in the cosmic calculus, then I need to be willing to risk my life for this person's life, because they're all the same. And I guess that was my little epiphany, and about the time that came to me, I could hear the army trucks. They had arrived and learned that I was there and had come to object to my presence. Mm-hmm. So I walked away. But I do believe that we are all interconnected, that what touches one life touches others in ways we don't always know, but that we at some level feel and face the consequences of. And I was privileged in being able to be in a country where people were suffering immensely and to try to tell their story.
What was the story? And for educational purposes, and that's what this tape is, what's the genesis of the conflict here that resulted in the genocide?
Ultimately, I mean, one can trace it back certainly to the fact that the Belgians had put the Tutsi, the tribe that had only 14% of the population, in all the positions of authority over the 85% majority. And they continued in that position. The Belgians established it when they were in control after 1918, and when they gave independence in 1961. Basically that pattern continued. And it developed, and there had been developing a huge cleavage between the rich and the poor, the educated, the uneducated, etc., on ethnic grounds. But ultimately, I think whenever we try to draw distinctions with somebody else, if we think, I'm white, you're black, I'm better than you are, or I'm Hispanic and you're something else and therefore I am better, and anytime we try to set up along ethnic lines, one is different from another, and one is, the one I'm part of is better than another, we're smarter, or we're more successful, or we're more moral, or whatever. Those kinds of distinctions deny our individuality, and they are oversimplistic and dangerous. And you've carried these to the extreme, and the ultimate extreme, whether it's with Adolf Hitler, saying, we, the Aryan races, are superior to the gypsies and the homosexuals and the Jews, and therefore we need to get rid of them and purify. Or if you were a Tutsi who says, we're superior in intellect, in achievement to the Hutu, we have to purify and deny them these opportunities. Anytime you set up distinctions on that basis, you are ultimately, potentially, on the road to genocide. Mm-hmm. And genocide isn't like just murder. It is much worse than murder. Because murder can be one person taking violent and unjustified reaction against some wrong from somebody else. Genocide means I want to wipe out your life, whoever you are. I don't care who you are individually. I just care that you are part of this group. I want your life to end. I want your values to end. I want perhaps your language to end. I may want your religion to end. I want to wipe from the face of the earth everything that is most valuable to you. It is to wipe out not only your individual existence, but everything that you value. And that is the cruelest subjugation of all. And I was privileged to live in a society where I could try to do something about that, not only to tell their story then and to tell their story now in the book, but I went out every week into the countryside. And I would go out sometimes twice a week. I interviewed people who had suffered and who had been slaughtered, and their survivors, and I would go back and I would give press conferences, and I would call CNN or Agence France Presse or BBC or whoever I could to try to get the story told, because murderers don't like to have their identities revealed. Mm-hmm. And did I end the slaughter? No. But I could end it in that place at that time. Mm-hmm. There were some lives saved because they stopped killing for a time. And every day I woke up and I just had two things in mind. What can I do to try to save the facade of democracy that still exists? And what can I do to save lives? And nothing else mattered to me.
At one point, well, I'm sure at several points, probably about one point, it was pretty manifest that you were a target.
Yes, after one particular exploration I did at the request of a missionary in an area called Butaganzwa, where I'd found 70 people who'd been slaughtered, 70 names that I had. There were more than that, but 70 names that I had that I was certain had been killed. And I gave a press conference, and I released the pictures, and I released the names of the people, and I told them what I had found in Bujumbura. And the consequence was that within about 10 days, La Nation and Le Carrefour des Idées, two of the newspapers in Burundi, on their front page, called for my assassination. Krueger, un homme pour l'assassination. And they did seek to assassinate me. They ambushed my convoy, and I was miraculously saved, but there were 2 killed and 8 grievously wounded in the car in front of me, behind me, and all around me, and bullets went through my car. So I was genuinely miraculously saved, and everyone in my immediate group survived without injury. But it did not stop me. I went, and I'm from Texas, and so I went back, and I knew that there'd be people in the State Department who'd want to withdraw me. And so I sent a telegram, because they were 8 hours after me, and it was nightfall there, but they'd have it the next morning. And I started off and I said, in Texas, if we fall off a horse, the first thing we do is get back on that horse. So we do it for 2 reasons. We don't want to have time to get afraid ourselves, and we want to show the horse who's boss. I said, now, if just because a bullet goes through my car, you pull me out, Burundians will think, well, all we have to do is take a shot at the American ambassador, and America pulls out and lets us do our own thing and doesn't bother us. Right. So they let me stay for a longer time. And then some months later, a CIA guy came through, as he did about once a month. And I didn't have very good experience, I'm afraid, with CIA. I don't think very much of them. But he came through and he talked to, I think he thought he was a sort of a James Bond, and he talked with a young French woman named Veronique, who was in charge of condom distribution, actually, for USAID. But Veronique, he didn't know, was living with a Tutsi lover, and she convinced him that there was a considerable danger of my being killed if I stayed around, and he sent back a cable without consulting me, which he's not supposed to do, but they break the rules a lot. And they pulled me out. I thought I was going back for consultation, which is what they told me, and packed a couple of summer suits, and they never allowed me to go back.
Right. Have you been back?
I have been back once since. I went back after 12 years, and it was the most humbling and touching experience of my life, because the majority of the people in Burundi cannot read and write, and the average age is 16, and I went back 12 years after. And I went back, and in the countryside, I would go into a village, and when people heard that Ambassador Krueger was back, they cheered in the marketplace. Yeah. And when I came back, I met with the president the first day, the new president. They now have a peacefully established Hutu president, free elections. And that evening, I was on the news in French and English and Kirundi. And the next morning, the Speaker of the House asked to see me, and when I got there, she had all of the TV and radio there, all the TV being the one station in the country. But that night, I was on all 3 newscasts. The next day, the President of Parliament asked to see me, the same story, he had the TV there. And I thought, it didn't have to be much of a politician to say, they think it's good to be seen with me. What it meant was that 12 years after, I was remembered, because I don't have any public position. I was just a private citizen. Right. And I was overcome by it, because everywhere that I went, I was honored as a hero. I certainly had never thought of myself as a hero. Mm-hmm. All that I was doing was try to save whatever lives I could, and to save democracy. But I talked with a woman who taught a course in the Holocaust, and told her about this. And I said, I wept at night, because I was so overcome that what little I did should be remembered. It seemed to be unjust, terribly unequal. And she said, no, she said, when people are subjugated, tortured, imprisoned, punished, murdered, totally denied any rights, and no one seems to care in the world, because if somebody cared, somebody would do something about it, then just to know that one person has spoken for them gives them some hope. Mm-hmm. I never thought of it in those terms. Right. I just went out to do my little daily work as such as I could. But I think that it was a lesson to me, certainly, when she explained that, and maybe it was a lesson that I stumbled onto and more or less got right when I was there. But it certainly meant a great deal to me, because after I went back, I basically said, thank you, God, that thank you, God, that I lost my Senate seat.
Yeah.
Because today, if I had stayed in the Senate, I never would have had to risk my life for somebody.
Right.
And what I found is that a person can risk your life, and it's not a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
It really isn't. You don't go out in the morning and thump your chest and say, hey, I'm going to risk my life today. All that happens is that you see suffering so immense that you've never seen anything like it before. And the injustice is so paramount and manifold that you just think, what can I do to try to lessen this? And as I said, I felt that I, being in the position as an ambassador is as the personal representative of the President of the United States, I was in a position to speak for these people who had no spokesperson, and to speak for the best values, I hoped, of our country, the values of democracy and of individual freedom. And so that was my privilege and my good fortune.
Part of your good fortune has also been a chance to interact with some interesting people, and of course, in neighboring Rwanda had a similar situation depicted by such movies as The Hotel Rwanda, and you had a chance to really befriend Paul
Rusesabagina.
Yes, thank you.
Paul and I have become very good friends, and this will sound like name dropping, but it really isn't. I did, because I've never met her in person, but I had written to Oprah Winfrey about Burundi, and at one point she phoned me, and we had about a 45-minute telephone conversation. She was as gracious and wonderful as her reputation, which is deserved, portrays. But she said, have you read Paul Rusesabagina's book, An Ordinary Man? And I said, no, I know the movie, but I haven't. So she happened to see him 3 days later when she won a Human Rights Award, the Elie Wiesel Award, and Paul was there. She said, Paul, you need to meet Bob Krueger. We were talking about you a few days ago. So Paul has with him a friend originally from Rwanda who lives in Texas, a doctor, who knew me personally.
Yeah.
And so they phoned me then, and Paul and I got together, and I've been twice to Belgium to speak at issues and forums that he's involved in. He came over for the announcement of our book, and in a particularly endearing moment, his wife Tatiana, when we were together, my wife and I, with them all week long, she said to my wife, she'd heard my wife refer to a godfather, and at the airport before they left to fly back to Brussels, where he is, she said, Kathleen, I lost my mother to genocide, I lost 2 of my sisters, and I lost my godmother. Would you be my godmother, and would Bob be my godfather? And we were touched, because it was a very serious thing to her, and therefore to us. He's a wonderful individual. He is, I believe, the honest person. He is honest about the fact that the genocide has not stopped in Rwanda. It continues, but we didn't want to recognize it before, and we don't want to recognize it now, because to recognize it is to say we have to do something about it. We don't want to admit that there's something to do. But the person who is head of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, is a consummate dictator. He was the one who led the forces in that drove out the first genocidaire. But his forces, I know because of the refugee camps that I went to, his forces sent the Hutus, terrified, into Burundi. And I visited those refugee camps every week, and I talked with them. And they were telling me about the slaughter that his forces were engaged in, and in some ways still are. And his country has revived economically, but Hitler's country revived under Hitler economically, but it didn't establish freedom. And when he was elected with 95% support, it wasn't an honest election, as the international observers observed. And the killing and the persecution is much more controlled, and the movement of people who come to the country is carefully controlled. And it's not as bad as, it's not as extensive as it was before, but the domination and persecution continues there. And Paul had to flee the country because of death threats against him, and they won't allow his book to be sold there, and they won't allow that movie, Hotel Rwanda, to be shown there.
Really?
And they won't allow my book to be shown there either. And they have intelligence forces that tried to mess up the announcement of my book. Paul and I were going together, and their embassy in Washington phoned and said that the University of Houston should not allow us to speak, and appeared when we appeared with Jesse Jackson at Project Hope in Chicago. Their ambassador showed up there, and there he claimed that Paul and I and another former American ambassador, Robert Flatten, who'd been American ambassador to Rwanda, he said that the three of us had been together on January 13th in Cape Town to buy arms to be used against Kagame and his forces. Whatever we are, we're not gun runners. It is preposterous. None of us had even been in the country. But that was their ambassador, their official representative, making that charge. They are paranoid, as all dictators are, because all of us tend to think that other people are like us, and if they've been willing to persecute and to dominate and to steal an election, they of course think that, others are intending to do the same thing.
You stay in touch then with Paul?
I last talked to him 8 days ago.
Okay.
My wife was there 2 weeks ago in Belgium. Yes, we're in close touch.
I'll be anxious to see you catch up tonight, in fact later this morning probably, with Hassan Jallow, who is the chief prosecutor of the tribunal at Rwanda.
I'll be interested to see what he has to say, because you see, none of the deal that was struck evidently was that none of the people who are in governmental power in Rwanda should be subject to examination by this court.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever he did is off base.
Yeah.
And they've spent $1 billion, and I'm not sure whether they've convicted 10 people for $1 billion or whether it's 20.
Yeah.
But it's very small. And we probably don't have time to get in this, but I personally believe that in many instances, including Burundi, the answer is not to bring charges and try to bring to trial everybody who is killed, because when 800,000 were killed in Rwanda and 300,000 in Burundi, and you have 6 Hutu attorneys in Burundi and very few, you can't possibly bring everybody there. And to prosecute a few people when people all throughout the country have killed is to me less important than what they did in South Africa. In South Africa with Nelson Mandela, who I think is one of the great figures of our time, is so superior. He didn't bring a single person to trial.
Mm-hmm.
Spent 27 years in prison himself, and knew of horrendous actions by the apartheid government, and charged nobody.
Mm-hmm.
And their country is back on a way to prosperity and to mutual respect, and has survived an apartheid. Whatever the difference might be between Hutu and Tutsi, there's so much intermarriage that to somebody from outside it's pretty hard to tell one from another.
Right.
But it's pretty easy when it's white and black. And South Africa has survived all of that and created a much more unified society because they were willing to let people express their griefs, those who suffered, to let those who had killed express their disappointment in themselves, and to have a healing through forgiveness. And I think that without bringing the truth to light and then saying, we have now brought it to light, now let us bury it and get on with things. As long as you leave it simmering and say we have to bring some more people to trial, or we have to try to find out who else may have killed, you are spending your time in suspicion rather than in trust. And my own experience suggests that the truth and reconciliation example is a superior one.
Mm-hmm. And this was is your paths crossed with Richard Goldstone's?
I have not met him, no. I certainly know of him, but I have not crossed.
But when you and Paul come here next year, Goldstone will be here when
Okay.
we do this. Does Robert Jackson mean anything to you in your world?
Well, I have been rereading some of the things about Robert Jackson, and in fact, as I was flying in from Kenya yesterday, I spent some time while I was awake. My body clock is kind of thrown off, but rereading the eloquent statement that Jackson made at the conclusion of his presentation at the Nuremberg trials. And I do feel that Nuremberg was a different circumstance in a number of ways from what we've encountered in Rwanda and Burundi. There you had people who, as a matter of continuous design, were proceeding with increasing genocide and violence against people. It was a known, defined undertaking by people who had enjoyed the privilege, briefly, of representative government, who were much more highly educated, and much more diabolical in that sense, because it was planned in a much larger measure. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and I talked when I was in Kenya this last week with a German constitutional scholar, and he said, yes, he said this was a thing in which our whole society was behind the efforts of the Nuremberg trials. It wasn't imposed on us against our will by people outside. He said we wanted, we who had, not that he personally was alive at that point, I don't think he was, he would have been a child if so, mm-hmm. But he said we as a society wanted this to be called to account and wanted these judgments to be made and wanted it to be known. And I think it was the right thing to do, and I think and interestingly enough, of course, Germany became a democratic society, very much a part of Europe and the world of democratic ideals, and I think it worked very well. And Jackson had obviously an important role. A combination of his eloquence and his balance and his fair-minded examination, I think, all fit together in a most impressive way, and I think he did the world a great service.
What's going to be the legacy of Bob Krueger? But you don't refer to as Robert or Bob?
My friends have all called me Bob, and that's fine. I don't know what my legacy. One can't define that. What I do know is that at this point in my life, I feel privileged at the opportunities that I've had, and I would like whatever I do to benefit life itself. As I said, my mother said, "Remember, Robert, that you've been given many things in life, that everything you take from life, you have to give back to life." And I feel that I have been privileged to enjoy a wide number of experiences, to have opportunities to learn and to serve. And I want to continue in whatever way I can that privilege of service. I have children now aged 20, 19, and 12, and I want to be useful to them. But I might also say that this is perhaps not directly to your question, but when we were in Burundi, my wife herself, and she's 20 years younger than I, she put her life at risk to save the life of a household employee, faced down 15 to 20 Burundi soldiers carrying AK-47 so that they wouldn't take him. And hugely to her credit, she never once suggested that I should not do what I was doing. Now, we had children aged 6 and 4 at the time. Our third hadn't been born. And if she had said, "Bob, you're putting yourself at risk, and, I might be a widow," and so forth, I would have been terribly torn in what to do. We never even discussed it. And that was an act of, I would say, considerable generosity and strength, and a gift to me that I didn't have to have some sort of divided conscience about what I was doing. So I would hope, in what time I have left, and since I have a 12-year-old son, I hope I have a number of years left, Uh, I would like to live a useful life, and I don't know. Oftentimes we never know what that will be. I just went to Kenya because a friend asked me to speak to a constitutional conference there on the Constitution, and I met with the president and the prime minister and others, experts from various countries. I wasn't paid for it, but I didn't need to be. The payment to me was if I had some useful insight to bring from America, because I said ethnic divisions have been the most painful rip in the social unity of this country since our founding. I said the fact that our European settlers brought African slaves into this country has given us the largest domestic fissure in our continent. And I said the Civil War killed more people when our population was a tenth of what it is today. We killed more people in the Civil War than all of our other wars combined. And I said it has torn us, and it took 91 years to get the Supreme Court to say that separate by definition means unequal. And so we had to integrate our schools now, 54 years ago, and took the Supreme Court to do it. And we have evolved in our understanding of the idea of all being created equal. But we have been at least determined, we haven't tried to hide it. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, so I think it's a great privilege to be an American, and I hope that, but I often, we don't know. I mean, I didn't know when I was saying, I think there's some reason for us to go to Burundi, but I don't know why, but I think we should go. I didn't know how meaningful it would be, and so I don't know whether anything will come of my remarks, whatever they were in Kenya or anything else. But I have found over and over in life that things, if we do them for the right reason, sometimes they bear good fruit, and we can't know what it is. And so I'll just go on, as long as I can, and trying to, having had the privilege of being present amid genocide, I want to tell the story of these people, most of whom cannot read and write, but who are human beings and whose lives have value. And if I can tell their story in some way that will make the world more sensitive, make us more sensitive here and the world generally, to what it is that we have to offer other people. To me, what America most of all has to offer when we're at our best is the example of democracy, the example of a country that, in my judgment, more than any in the history of the world, has sought to develop the potential of its people. And that recognition that at some level that we have held that ideal, even though we fall short of it constantly, but the ideal that all are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, etc. This has held our country together. We are held, most countries were held together by a royal family or some bloodline or some ethnic line or tribal line or whatever. In America, we are held together by, a piece of paper, and, the Constitution of the United States could probably be written on a couple of pieces of paper like this. And that is what our loyalty ultimately is to the Constitution and the ideals enshrined therein, and enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, enshrined in statements like Lincoln's government of the people, by the people, for the people. So I think that's what we have to offer the world. And it's a huge gift. And we need to keep that in mind rather than, do these people like us? Do we need their minerals? What does it mean if we can't have certain advantages in trading, or if we can't get all of what we need of these minerals that they have, and so forth? That's not our best instinct.
Wow, you're a true patriot.
I hope so.
Oh, really, this has been incredible. And I really am thrilled that you're among us. I look forward to listening to you this evening and introducing you to the Jackson Center, but also, more importantly, your crowd will be not your normal crowd tonight. It's going to be one which is looking forward with great interest to your topic matter, and you're going to have prosecutors from Nuremberg, from the current prosecutors, to some folks who've traveled some great distance with extreme interest.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation.
Well,
I hope to be back to this beautiful community.
well, we hope you will too. Thank
Thank
you.
you.